Dr. Rajan Prasad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to inform Mr. Macleay that indeed it is precisely that experience that you think we ought to have, as the member thinks we should have before we address bills of this nature. Well, I did work with many of these families. I worked with them for years. I've also developed many workers to work with them and indeed researched much of the background from which these families come. And the member seeks an assurance that we do speak from that kind of background. And indeed, from that background, I am convinced that the kinds of provisions that this bill comes up with are not what those families require. I don't disagree a great deal with the member when the member talks about some of what these families need. And indeed, that is true. That's what they need. But where in this bill, where in the philosophical thinking behind this bill, where in the principles that guide this bill are the provisions that will enable that to happen, because they are not there. I too, Mr. Speaker, would like to thank the officials who worked with us over the last 12 months. I also want to thank the Parliamentary Council, who also helped design some of the amendments we required. And also I want to acknowledge the Chair, of Katrina Shanks, who led and chaired with good humour and indeed enabled us all to participate, and also contributions from members from both sides. The bill, however, Mr. Speaker, has a checkered history, and that forces me to really suspect the background, the real motivation for this particular bill. This bill was introduced under urgency in February 2009. And that would immediately say to us there is an urgent problem that needs to be addressed, and we will do this fairly quickly. Sent to the Select Committee quite early as well. And the committee also, by April, as I understand, had really begun to receive submissions, and through May and by June had heard many of those submissions. But it was at that point, when we were waiting for the departmental report, there was this vacuum. There was a direction from the Minister, a letter that was sent to the Select Committee, saying that, the officials needed to do some more policy work. And we asked, what was the policy work that was being done? Because here was the Select Committee really, having heard all of the submitters, having understood what this bill was trying to do, wanted to know what their thinking was. None was provided. And indeed, what we realized later on was indeed a trial of the particular boot camps, military-style training, was underway. And at that point, I became very suspicious, and I'm still suspicious. And I ask, is this a real attempt to address the complex and fundamental issues our young people face? And knowing now what we know through research and the evidence that exists, or is this merely a demonstration or a working out of some kind of attack or some attempt really to be punitive, to be seen to be punitive, to be seen to be tough on crime? And in that particular flush, some of the provisions of this bill begins to make sense to me. I don't agree with them, but they begin to make sense to me. The Minister, in her statements at the beginning of the second reading, said this was indeed about targeting the underlying causes of offending. And I'm not at all convinced, Mr. Speaker, that this bill actually does that. Because the government's own work on the drivers of crime says that we need to move from a retributive or punitive model to a restorative, rehabilitative one. But the bulk of the provisions in here are really still quite punitive, even though there's some wraparound services, as they talked about, but it still is quite punitive. And indeed, in the government's own work around drivers of crime, if it really was sincere in wanting to address that, then this would be not the type of bill that comes here. Much of it would be around poor parenting, poor education, attachments, disconnectedness from the wider society that many of these young people feel, failure to provide the right environment that parents are unable to provide, some of the deterioration that's taking place in family, community and cultural supports and structures like that. And also there would be a much more aggressive attempt to look at poverty and transience and the demands on parents and particularly single parents. And indeed, the drivers of crime material would take us there. No, this bill does not talk about those provisions, but indeed it makes, as my colleagues have already pointed out, one of the most fundamental changes in child welfare legislation in this country in the last several decades. And this is taking 12 and 13-year-olds through to youth court jurisdiction. That is a very serious move. That is a move that forces us to begin to contemplate that particular stage of development, 12 and 13. We have been parents. We have brought these young people up. But for the grace of God, some of our own children could have strayed, if you like, at 12 and 13. When that happens, and I'm sure it's happened to members of families in this chamber and indeed people that we know and have worked with, when that happens, it's not a punitive approach that is the response. It is beginning to address all of those complex of factors, including our own behavior, the way our family operates, the way we have supported our young people in our community, etc., that we begin, and the particular demands of the young people themselves in terms of their own personalities. It's when we have addressed those kinds of things we've begun to manage this transition of the early teens into later teens. But and Judge Andrew Beecroft was very clear about that fundamental shift. And he really was saying to me, be careful about that. Is this what we particularly want? Because we know 12 and 13-year-olds primarily have care and protection needs. They don't have the need to be, for us as a society, to be retributive, to really get our ounce of flesh, if you like. You know, in the kind of decent society in which we live, 12 and 13-year-olds will always demand that we address their care and protection needs. We do have a court, Mr. Speaker, that specializes on those care and protection needs. And while that court is not perfect, and while indeed they might require more resources and they could be more timely and what have you, it is those shortcomings that should have been addressed if we really had in mind the care and protection needs of 12 and 13-year-olds. I've spent half my life working with this particular population. And that's what they require. And in the time that I worked with these young people, having fought the system that sought to be punitive towards them was what we were trying to do, trying to get around the punitive approaches of days gone past. They're coming back. And this is a fundamental change, Mr. Speaker, that we will live to regret, because now it's 12 and 13-year-olds. What's going to happen if that group becomes much more troublesome? Do we go back, or 10, 11-year-olds get troublesome? Do we keep going backwards, or do we use a different approach? Mr. Speaker, I also want to talk briefly about the boot camps. We pride ourselves. People come to select committees saying that my government will listen to us. Parliament will listen to us. And they take a lot of pride in that. They put a lot of emphasis on what they do. Mr. Speaker, here were experts, people who work with this group, said this particular model does not work. Not one of them has been listened to, because here it is in the bill as originally envisaged, and that's a particular problem. I don't think in this particular government there is a serious attempt to look at really the programs that achieve change. Te Hurihanga is a program that was achieving change. The minister said, oh, but 4 of them reoffended. But what she didn't tell us, what indeed was that the overall rate reduced 82%. And the select committee visited that particular program. The minister, Mr. Powell, says it was useless. This particular select committee visited them. In a disingenuous kind of way, that minister added the cost of the plant to the cost of the first 8 or so kits. The minister did. That's how the minister is reported. But here was a program that was working successfully. And now the plan is to close them down. This is the kind of... We visited this program, Minister. We visited the program. Well, we spent some time on it. Not one person in this select committee disagreed with that. But the Minister is not really